Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters for the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. 75 years after the end of World War II, we are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore one of the most serious and consequential events in history with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Chris Wallace is the anchor of Fox News Sunday. In his 16 years at Fox, Wallace has covered almost every key political event. Throughout his 5 decades in broadcasting, he has interviewed numerous U.S. and world leaders, including 7 American presidents, and won every major broadcasting news award for his reporting, including 3 Emmy Awards, the DuPont Columbia Silver Baton, and the Peabody Award. He is the author of the new book, Countdown 1945, The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb and the 116 Days That Changed the World. I'm also pleased to extend a warm welcome back to David Martin, our moderator for this evening. David has served as CBS News' national security correspondent, covering the Pentagon and the State Department since 1993, after joining CBS as its Pentagon correspondent in 1983. He has reported virtually every major defense, intelligence, and international affairs story for the CBS Evening News, as well as for other broadcasts, including 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. He has received numerous awards for his reporting, including several Emmy Awards and 2 DuPont Columbia Awards. Please join me in welcoming our special guests. Chris, thank you. We're so looking forward to your introduction to this topic.
Alan, thank you, and thank you all for coming in, subscribing, and joining us tonight. A couple of things I want to say just as introduction. I don't live in Boston. I didn't grow up in Boston, but I spent a lot of time on Morrissey Boulevard. I went to Harvard, and right out of Harvard, I went to work for the Boston Globe. That was my first job for 4 years. So I know that part of Boston very well, and when the Kennedy Library was built, long after I started at the Globe, it was a great addition. It's a magnificent presidential library. I've been fortunate to go to several. It's one of my favorites. I thought I would just start briefly with how I came up with the idea, and then David and I can have a conversation. I had been thinking for some period of time that I would like to write what I will call a historical thriller. And I originally got the idea from reading another book that I would very much recommend to you called April 1865 by Jay Winnick, a very respected historian, which looks at the first 2 weeks of April in 1865. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. And 2 weeks later, and a number of things happen in the intervening period of time, Lincoln gives a major speech signifying the end of the Civil War from the South Portico of the White House. And then, of course, on April 14th, he's assassinated at Ford's Theater. And I thought that it read more like a novel than history, because he really, when it took you into the scene and you felt you almost could see everything that was happening during those 2 weeks. And I thought I would love to write a book like that, but I couldn't ever come up with my April 1865 until February of 2019, when President Trump was going to deliver his State of the Union address, and a few of the anchors were invited by Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, to a pre-buttal. And both parties do that. When the speaker is of one party and the president is of the other, the speaker will invite you to an event in the Capitol to tell you how everything the president is going to say before the president has actually said it is all wrong. So that's why they call it a pre-buttal. So in any case, the speaker told us that we were in a room called the Board of Education, which I was very excited about. I'm not sure any of my colleagues knew or cared, but that was the room that Sam Rayburn, when he was Mr. Sam, the speaker in the 1940s, had used for cronies to come over and gossip and get marching orders and to drink a bourbon and branch water. And she said it was in this room that Harry Truman had called the White House, had been told that he was to call the White House, called them, and was told to uh, come to the White House as quickly and quietly as he possibly could. And Pelosi tells the story that as Truman finishes the phone call, he hangs up the phone and he says, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson," which was the first time I'd ever heard that exclamation. And I suddenly found for the rest of the night, I wasn't thinking about the 45th president of the United States. I was thinking about the 33rd, and I knew I had my moment. I didn't know then, but in doing the counting, I saw it was 116 days from that day in April of 1945 until August of 1945, August 6th, when Truman and the U.S. dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. I just want to tell you a little bit briefly about that day, April 12th. So Truman gets the word to go to the White House, and he slips his Secret Service detail. His driver, Tom Hardy, takes him in his official car. It was rainy, it was congested, but it was 1945, so it took 10 minutes to get from the Capitol to the White House. And when Truman gets there, he's wondering, why am I here? Why am I being summoned? And he believed that FDR, who had been in Warm Springs, Georgia, must have secretly come back to Washington and wanted to speak to him, which was a bit unusual because Truman, who had been vice president for 82 days, had only met privately with Roosevelt twice in those 3 months. And so he was a little surprised and a little concerned as to why Roosevelt had summoned him, because he didn't usually do that. So he arrives at the White House and he's ushered in the elevator, the presidential elevator, up to the second floor. And when he gets there, Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, comes out to greet him, and she is dressed in black. And she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman, who thought that he had gone there to talk to the president, now realizes he is the president. So the White House springs into action. Most people were out of town because the president was supposed to be out of town in Warm Springs. And they call a meeting of the cabinet. They call the Chief Justice of the United States, Harlan Stone, to come swear him in. Truman has to call his wife, Bess, who at that time, because there was no presidential mansion, is living in a 2-bedroom apartment, quite modest, up Connecticut Avenue from the White House, along with their daughter, Margaret, and Bess's mother, Mrs. Wallace, who the vice president, now the president's mother-in-law, the 4 of them living in this 2-bedroom apartment. So everybody had to get to the White House. And one of the other problems is they couldn't find a Bible in the White House. And finally, they found a Gideon Bible in the desk of the chief usher in the White House. So everybody assembles in the cabinet room. There's a picture in the book, Countdown 1945, of all of the top officials assembled behind the Chief Justice and the President. And right behind him, right the closest to him, are Bess Truman and Margaret Truman. Stone gives the swearing in, gives the oath of office, and he says, "I, Harry Ship Truman," thinking that the S of Harry S. Truman comes from the family name on the father's side, Ship. But in fact, as most of you I'm sure know, the S stood for absolutely nothing. So Truman corrects him and says, "I, Harry S. Truman." They do the oath, but then the Chief Justice realizes that as they had done the oath, Truman was holding the Bible on his left hand, but he had his right hand on top of the Bible. He had not raised his right hand to take the oath, so they have to do it over again. Anyway, they finally get it done. And he talks to the cabinet and basically says, "I want your best advice. I want you all to stay on. I want to pursue the Roosevelt agenda. But I will make the final decision. And when I do, I want all of you to tell me what you think. But once I make the decision, I want you all to support me." That's going to be the end of the evening, except that Henry Stimson, who is 77 years old then, he's the Secretary of War, says, Mr. President, I need to talk to you privately. Stimson had served 5 presidents. Truman would be his 6th. He takes him into another room and he says to him, Mr. President, I need to tell you about an immense top secret project to develop the most powerful weapon in history. And that is literally the first moment that Harry Truman had any inkling. He'd been the vice president for 3 months, 82 days, the first inkling that he had about the existence of the Manhattan Project to develop an atom bomb. Roosevelt had never shared it with him. So that's the first chapter of the book. I think that's a good place to stop. And I leave it to our moderator tonight, David Martin.
Thank you, Chris. I want to make 2 disclaimers before we start for the benefit of the audience. One, I have already interviewed Chris about this book for a story we did about it a couple of weeks ago for Sunday morning, and I warn you that I lost total control of that interview. You ask one question and he's off on a tear that only ends when he realizes that he has to let you ask another question, because that's what the format requires. And our editor was actually a little worried that he came across as gleeful about this terrible, terrible event in history. But you will see, I think, as you already have seen, it's really just enthusiasm for one of the greatest stories in our history, one of the most dramatic stories in our history. So if I lose control again tonight, that's okay, because he tells it better than I can. The second thing I want to say is that the book is published by a division of Viacom CBS. We're always required to mention that. It has absolutely zero to do with my opinion of the book, but I want you to know that. My opinion of the book is that no matter how much you know or don't know about the dropping of the atom bomb, you will find this a good read. And if you're coming to the story for the first time and you only have time to read one book, you couldn't do better than start off with Countdown. So with that, let me ask Chris the first question, and if it's the last you hear from me tonight, that's okay. What was Truman's reaction to Stimson's telling him that he had this wonder weapon?
So I'm going to answer in single sentences, because in a very graceful way, David is telling me be a little briefer. And as we got into the 2-hour mark of our interview at my home here in Annapolis, which is where I've been sheltering in place these last 3 months, I realized I was going on a little bit long. The answer is that he was puzzled, but kind of overwhelmed. You got to remember that he had just, he had no idea this was going to happen. He suddenly had become president. He's now in charge. He's the commander-in-chief of prosecuting the wars in Europe and the Pacific. He has to deal with the whole panoply of issues. And one of the things that was most interesting is that Stimson, I told you what he told him. That's all he told him. He basically said, look, I know you've got a lot on your plate. I'll come back after you've settled in and tell you more. So in fact, it was 13 days later, April 25th, before he finally sat down with him and told him any more about what the Manhattan Project was. And now I'm done, David. You're back on.
Pressure's on me now. So he gets a fuller briefing from Stimson and who else, and exactly what do they tell him? And now that he's hearing about it in detail, what is his reaction?
He meets, it's very interesting. On April 25th, he has on his calendar that he's going to meet with Stimson again. And Stimson was this wonderful, he was like the exemplar of the Eastern establishment. He had first served at William Howard Taft in his administration in the 19 teens. And now here he is in the 1940s serving his 6th president. And he gives him a first briefing. And the first paragraph basically says, we're going to, within 4 months, have the most powerful weapon in history. And then it goes on and it says that it would be able to destroy an entire city with one explosion. Meanwhile, General Leslie Groves, who was a bulldozer of a man, well over 6'5" and 250, and his personality echoed his size and his bulk. He had just finished building the Pentagon, and which was the largest building in the world, and had kind of bulldozed through that, oftentimes ordering around people who were much higher ranked than he was. And he is secreted through underground tunnels to get into the White House. He doesn't come through the front door because they're concerned that those pesky reporters are going to see Stimson and Groves. And of course, nobody even knows that Groves for 3 years had been running the Manhattan Project, and they're going to wonder what the heck the two of them are doing there. So they snuck him in, and he has a much more detailed memo, about 25 pages, and in much more technical detail. And Truman has a copy, and the two of them have a copy, and he's reading it and then asking questions, and they're trying to explain to him things. And at one point, he complains, Truman does, that this is technical, and he doesn't like reading long technical papers like this. And Groves says, you know, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but this is a complicated project, and we can't make it any simpler. So they meet for about 45 minutes, and he takes it in, and he's very interested. But remember, this is April 25th. The bomb has never been tested. They still don't know whether or not it's going to work. And so when you say, what was his reaction? I think he thought, this is an interesting science project, but I have no idea whatsoever whether or not it's going to be of practical use to me in ending the war either in Europe or the Pacific.
Did they describe to him the magnitude of this undertaking? And if not, would you describe it to people who are listening in?
They did describe it, but this is one of the parts of the story that I find most intriguing. I think I said to David in our interview that one of the reasons I loved researching and writing this story is because it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And I didn't mean that as a slam on Trump, but as David knows, if you're a reporter in Washington now, you're consumed with Donald Trump. He makes a lot of news. You can like it, you can not like it, but everything is highly controversial and highly debated. And as much as difficult as it is to write a history book, it was kind of a break and a relief from current day Washington. The other point, though, that I found so refreshing is that the Manhattan Project had been started in 1942 by FDR. It was 125,000 people working all across the country, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in Hanford, Washington, the flight crew, the 509th Composite Group, which was hundreds of pilots and bombardiers and ordnance officers and gunners and support crews. They're working in Wendover, Utah. They'd spent $2 billion already, which Truman, who before he was sworn in as vice president, had been a key senator who was looking at defense expenditures, and he knew nothing about this $2 billion expenditure. The point is that this was a massive project that had been going on for years, and everybody had kept the secret. There was such unity, such a sense of the country coming together in common cause, and nobody wanted to blow the whistle on this. So the secret held. And you know, I couldn't help but think every once in a while as I'm writing it that today, if they had a project of 125,000 people to bake apple pies, that by day 2, somebody would send out a tweet and say that this was outrageous and they were blowing the whistle on it and they were going to report it to the Inspector General. So it was a much more innocent, much more unified time. And again, that was a relief from Washington today.
The secret held, but we should point out that the Manhattan Project was thoroughly penetrated by Soviet intelligence agents who were telling Stalin exactly what was going on and giving Soviet scientists the blueprints to the bomb.
Yeah, I'll jump ahead just quickly and tell the story. So they end up, when the key decisions are made in July, Truman ends up in Potsdam, Germany, a suburb of Berlin, to have a meeting with Churchill and Joseph Stalin. It's the new big three. He's now trying to fill FDR's shoes. And Churchill had been a partner of this project all along. In fact, he had been the one who had really spurred Churchill, or rather Roosevelt in 42, to get going on the Manhattan Project because they were so scared that Hitler and the Nazis were going to get the project first. So Churchill and Truman knew all about it, and they're in Potsdam when they have the first test on July 16th of the bomb, and the word comes back it's a complete success. But so one of the big discussions that Churchill and Truman have is, when are we going to tell Stalin, who they think knows nothing about it? And finally, just before the summit ends in late July, at the end of one of the individual sessions of the Potsdam Conference, Truman comes around the table and goes up to Stalin and uses the Russian translator to basically say, we have developed an unbelievably powerful super weapon. And Stalin says, well, that's very nice. I hope you'll put good use to it. And that's it. And then he walks away. And Truman is stunned at the indifference of Stalin. And Churchill comes over to Truman and says, what happened? And he explains what happens. And Churchill says, are you sure that the message got through, that it was translated? And he said, yeah, he seemed to get it. He just didn't seem to care. Well, the point was, he totally cared, but he wasn't surprised, because exactly as David said, that the program had been penetrated. A member of the Manhattan Project team had given it to a Russian intermediary, and the word had gotten back to the Russians. And interestingly enough, that night, after the Russians go back to their private quarters, somebody overhears Molotov, who was the foreign minister of Russia, and Stalin talking, and they say, wait, we better get going on this project, because I guess the U.S. is further along than we thought they were. And a historian later said that that moment, 7:25 p.m. on that night in Potsdam, Germany, was the beginning of the Cold War.
Well, the beginning of the nuclear arms race was July 16th, right?
Well, you could say, in fact, it was before then, because, the Russians already knew about it and were getting going. They didn't, incidentally, explode their first nuclear device until 1949, but clearly after he told, later in July, about a week or two later, Truman told Stalin, that was the beginning of the nuclear arms race in the Cold War.
But in retrospect, of course, it all seems so inevitable. Of course it worked. But what was it like on the morning of July 16th when they were to find out for the first time whether all this theoretical work was in fact going to produce a bomb?
It's so interesting. So Truman and all of his top staff, including Stimson, they are all in Potsdam, Germany, which is 8 hours ahead of Alamogordo, New Mexico, which is where the first test is going to take place. And Truman is quite nervous, because he realizes that if this works, and he's very aware and a little bit insecure about the fact that he's very much the junior partner. Roosevelt and Churchill had been quite good friends. They'd spent over 100 nights together during World War II. And of course, Roosevelt had numerous summits with Stalin. So they all knew each other. They were the club. And now here's the new one replacing the leader of the club. And so, and he knows that his standing in the club could be dramatically affected by whether or not this bomb works or not. Well, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, Alamogordo time, 8 hours later, you can do the addition. So sort of mid-afternoon in Potsdam, they explode the bomb. And there was such mystery, and this is part of what I loved about writing this book, is instead of doing it as history, and here we know what happened. Now here's why it happened. I try to take you into what was going on, and I think it's one of the most thrilling scenes in the book at Alamogordo. And the fact is, the top scientists are there, and it's like March Madness. They are literally betting on what's going to happen. And it goes all the way from several people who say it's a dud, it's not going to work at all, to people who say it is going to ignite the atmosphere. And then they are disagreeing. Will it just ignite the atmosphere and take out New Mexico, or will it ignite the atmosphere and take out the Western United States? So there was utter, unknown and speculation and some concern and worry about what was going to happen when they hit the button and detonated the gadget.
And then what happens?
It lived up to its billing. It was an absolutely massive explosion. People described it. They were all told that they were to put on welder's glasses to, shield their eyes. But then not only that, they were to lie face down, feet pointed towards the explosion, head pointed away, everything they could. And then after the initial explosion, they could look up. And that it was like 1,000 midday suns, the brightness, the intensity of this, then a huge explosion that billowed into a mushroom cloud that reached 40,000 feet into the sky, and everything in the desert was vaporized. There was a 100-foot tower. It wasn't dropped. It was detonated while it was placed on a 100-foot tower. The steel tower vaporized. Every living thing from antelope to blades of grass disappeared. 1,000-foot long crater was gashed into the ground, and that was when the scientific director, Robert Oppenheimer, quoting a Sanskrit gospel, said, "I am death, destroyer of worlds."
And how much of that information is conveyed to Truman over in Potsdam?
Well, he is, that night, it's about 8 o'clock at night by the time the word finally gets to him. And he is sitting with Jimmy Burns, who was at that point just a top advisor, would become the secretary. I think by that point he'd become Secretary of State. And Stimson runs in, and he's got the memo. And it's a very, very brief memo, but it basically says it worked even beyond what we had expected. What's a little more delicious is the next day, another memo cable is sent, and there was a map room where the cryptographers were, where they would take these messages and translate it. But the message was very much in code anyway, and it basically says that the baby's been born. Its scream can be heard from here to Harrison's farm, and I guess it can be seen from here to Highhold. Highhold was Stimson's estate on Long Island, which was 250 miles away, and Harrison's farm was George Harrison, who was one of his top assistants. And that was 50 miles away from Washington. But all the talk about the baby, the military people who were translating this code and giving it to Stimson thought maybe Stimson had just become the father of a baby, which they were quite impressed with, given the fact that he was 77 years old. So that was a source of entertainment for Stimson and for the president.
So now you could say the president has a bigger problem. It works. Now what do I do? Did he know right from the start that if it worked, he was going to use it?
He didn't admit it to himself. I mean, deep down, maybe he knew, but he struggled. That was one of the other great revelations to me, because I didn't know, I knew a little bit about Harry Truman. I didn't know a lot. And what I knew was kind of the stereotype, the famously decisive president, the buck stops here. He made a decision and he never second guessed himself. And I've had some pushback from some historians, but it's clear to me, and I spent time researching this at the Truman Library. I had access to his diaries, the letters he wrote to his wife and his mother and his daughter. He agonized over this. He complained of sleepless nights in the little White House in Babelsberg, which was very near Potsdam. He also complained of searing headaches, which he had whenever he was under a lot of stress. And his diaries are very instructive because he describes this weapon, and he kept calling it this terrible weapon, this terrible bomb, in apocalyptic terms. He talked about the fire destruction prophesied in the Bible. So he was well aware of just how massive this was. And even after the explosion, he has long and knows that the bomb works. It's not a science project anymore. He has long discussions with his war cabinet. George Marshall is there. Other people are there. Stimson. He has long discussions with his chief of staff, Admiral Leahy, who continued to say that the bomb wasn't going to work. In one conversation after this, he has a long discussion with George Marshall, where they go over, as they had throughout, what would it take? Because it wasn't either drop the bomb or nothing. It's drop the bomb or invade. And Marshall said, you're going to need, odd number, 766,700 troops to invade. And this is July of 45. He said that the projection was it was going to take until November of 46. The war would continue for another year and a half. And the projection was that there would be 1 million Japanese casualties and 500,000 American casualties. And at one point, Truman writes, I think the flower of American youth is worth a couple of Japanese cities.
So that brings up the cities. How was Hiroshima chosen?
Well, interestingly enough, they wanted a city, and there was a whole target committee and an interim committee, and a lot of the top scientists were involved in this. James Conant, the president of Harvard, was involved. I mean, this was, the establishment of mid-century America. They decided that they wanted to bomb a city that hadn't been bombed before because they wanted to show just how destructive this weapon was, both for military effect and for psychological effect. Churchill talked about, we think the Japanese who refuse to surrender are going to need a shock or two to force them into surrender. So they wanted to find a city that hadn't been bombed. They wanted to find a military target. And while Hiroshima was a city of 250,000 civilians, it was also a city that garrisoned about 50,000 Japanese troops. And they were also looking for a city that had the right topography. And Hiroshima was surrounded by hills. And they believed that when the bomb dropped, and they weren't going to have it drop and hit the ground, they wanted it to drop about 1,800 feet above the city because they thought it would have maximum explosive power. And the topography of Hiroshima, with those hills, would magnify the explosion. So they wanted as strong and powerful and damaging and deadly an explosion as possible. And Hiroshima fit the bill.
Was there any doubt in anybody's mind that women and children were going to be killed?
None whatsoever. As I say, it was a city of 250,000 people.
Okay, so now you've chosen your city, but there's the problem of actually dropping the bomb on the city, which was an operation in itself. How was that handled?
Well, again, I was talking before, there was something called the 509th Composite Group, and this was a specially trained group, really the top airmen in the Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force yet, the Army Air Corps, and it included pilots and, as I say, bombardiers and navigators. And at several points, people tried to take the project away from them. General Curtis LeMay, who was a very important person in the Pacific Theater, he tried to take this project, and a lot of them didn't fully know, that the top people did, that it was an atom bomb, but a lot of the people in the crew didn't know about it. In any case, they had trained and went over Utah, and then in the late spring, they moved to Tinian Island, which was a little island in the middle of the Pacific, about 1,500 miles away from Hiroshima, and a perfect launch pad. to drop the bomb. And the funny thing is that Tinian looked a little bit like the shape of Manhattan. And so when they laid it out, and there were a lot of other conventional flight crews there because there were a lot of conventional flight missions, bombing missions over Tokyo. So it was a big operation. They had various streets, and the 509th was stationed on 125th Street. That was the location in the island as it compared to Manhattan. And there was tremendous jockeying. There were about more than 7 flight crews, full flight crews, 12-man flight crews, and tremendous jockeying for who was going to be on the mission, even though most of them had no idea what the mission was. They just knew that it was a mission with a weapon that could potentially end the war. The head of the operation was a fellow named Paul Tibbets, a colonel. He was the commander, one of the top pilots in Europe, and then he had been brought back to the States to master this new plane, the B-29 Super Fortress. He was the one who assembled most of the crews. And frankly, most of the people he put on his mission were people he had flown on bombing missions in Europe with, like Thomas Farabee and Dutch Van Kirk and Bob Caron. These were all a bombardier and a navigator and a tail gunner. There was only one gun on the plane, the tail gunner, a fellow named Bob Caron, who always stayed out of uniform because he wore a Brooklyn Dodgers cap as he sat in the tail gun turret area of the plane.
So Paul Tibbets probably is the name most identified with dropping the bomb because he spoke about it for so many years after. Incidentally, his grandson is a B-2 bomber pilot with the U.S. Air Force, or at least he was when I talked to him a couple of years ago. So you've got this weapon, this terrible weapon that you've got to fly from Tinian to Hiroshima. What are the hazards in just getting it there?
Well, the first one is that even though they had a stripped down B-29, the bomb weighed about 10,000 pounds, and it was going to be in the front of the plane. So to balance it, they had to put a lot of extra load of gasoline in the back of the plane. Well, this was more weight than they had ever taken off with before. So there was a lot of concern that as the plane headed down the runway at Tinian, that it might crash. Well, you don't want any plane to crash, but you particularly don't want a plane to crash with an atom bomb. They only seem to have arrived at this problem a few days before. So they suddenly realized we don't want a live atom bomb taking off from the island, because if it crashes, Tinian Island will be blown into the Pacific. So Deke Parsons, who was the ordnance officer, said, you know what, I need to arm the bomb once we've taken off and we're on our way. So I won't have to, endanger the island. And they say, well, do you know how to do that? And he says, no, I don't, but I'll learn. So while it's on the ground, he's sitting there in the bomb bay, and there really wasn't room. A lot of them said, you can't do it. And cradled next to the first atom bomb, which was called Little Boy, although it was anything but, practicing how to do it. And they actually armed the bomb rather, while the plane was on its way 1,500 miles to Hiroshima. So that was problem one. Problem two was, because they wanted it to land not while still in midair, normally you would have had an impact fuse. So on impact, it would have exploded, but they wanted it to explode 1,800 feet up, so they had a proximity fuse. And that meant that it operated on a certain frequency, and there was radar they were going to use to detonate it when it was 1,800 feet above the ground. The concern was that the Japanese might somehow, either through espionage or luck, come hit the frequency and detonate the bomb while it was en route after it had been armed. So they had a radar countermeasures person, and his job was so important that he was the only person, one, that didn't fly on any missions in the Pacific. His name was Jacob Beezer. He was a radar countermeasures person. He didn't fly on any mission because he was essential to the flight. And I think he was the only person who flew on both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki missions because, again, he was essential to the flight. And the third concern was that they had no idea because it had never been dropped from a plane. It had only been tested that one time in Alamogordo. They had no idea what the shock waves, what the impact would be once the bomb exploded. So they had practiced over and over again to just pitch the plane into an 180-degree turn and a steep dive. And even with all of that, they had no certainty that the shock waves from the explosion wouldn't knock the plane, the Enola Gay, right out of the sky.
So before we go to questions, you have to tell the story of the people on the ground. You interviewed one of the survivors. Tell us about that.
Well, just briefly, let me see. Yeah, we are almost need to go to questions. Obviously, the vast majority of the people, everybody that I've talked about so far, has died. This is the 75th anniversary this summer. But there were a couple of people, younger, obviously, who were alive. One of them was a woman in Oak Ridge who had been operating, not knowing what she was doing. She was just fiddling with knobs on a machine. A Calitron girl, her name was Ruth Sisson, and she's still alive. She's in her 90s. But there was also Hideko Tamura, who was 10 years old at the time, lived in Hiroshima, and she was on the ground when the bomb exploded. Interestingly enough, her mother, Kimiko, because again, Hiroshima hadn't been hit, but a lot of cities had been hit. And Kimiko, her mother, kept drilling her if there was a conventional bomb, which is what everything they expected, like a firebombing of Tokyo, here's what you need to do, because maybe I won't be with you. And she was told two things. One, get under something sturdy like a table or get in a doorway because the building, the home we were in will collapse and you don't want to be crushed by the debris. And two, as soon as you are able to dig yourself out, get out of the house because there will be an explosion and a fire, and get to the river. The Ota River runs right through the middle of Hiroshima because that way you can escape the fire. Well, it turned out on the morning of August 6th that Kimiko had gone out to do some civil defense operations. So little Hideko, 10 years old, was all by herself. Everything happened just the way her mother predicted. The house collapsed. She had gotten under some heavy furniture. She dug herself out. A number of members of her family had died. Some of them were just sort of paralyzed by the shock. So this little 10-year-old girl goes off by herself, and yes, there are fires breaking out all over the place, goes to the river and saves herself.
And she's alive today.
And she's alive today. She's in her mid-80s. She lives in Bend, Oregon. She came to the United States for college in the 50s. And she went to Worcester College, married an American, had children and grandchildren, and lives in Bend, Oregon, and is a force of nature. She's just a remarkable woman.
So you've met her?
I have met her, and interestingly enough, for the documentary, I asked her to fly to Washington, which she did. And, in one of these cases of truth is stranger and more colorful than fiction, she said, I'll come to Washington on one condition. What's that? I want to see the Enola Gay. I never would have dreamt of asking her to do that, but she wanted to see it for closure. And so we... The
Enola Gay being...
The plane that dropped the bomb that destroyed her city and killed her mother. So we drove out to the Udvar-Hazy Annex. It's part of the Air and Space Museum out near Dulles Airport, and the Enola Gay is there. And I was understandably concerned how she would react. She was very quiet. She wanted to take it in. I asked her if she was angry when she saw the plane. She said, no, I just feel deep grief. But she found some closure with the plane. And at the end, she put her hands up and she said a prayer for peace. And then she looked up at the plane and said, sayonara.
So I guess the question that everybody's going to ask, that I've gotten a lot of questions here, some of which I wish I had thought to ask you in our earlier interview. But first I need to ask you, did Truman do the right thing?
Well, look, everybody's going to have their own view of that. I'll put it in a slightly different way. I don't think he had any choice but to do this. He came into the presidency, he's been called the accidental president. And, the larger than life figure who had preceded him, Roosevelt, had authorized this program almost 3 years before. As I said, 125,000 people working on it, $2 billion spent. They had come up with a bomb. And it wasn't like you either drop the bomb or do nothing. You either drop the bomb or you invade Japan. And as I've said, the estimates were if you invade Japan, it's going to take another year and a half, and you're going to probably have a 500,000 American casualties, best estimate, and 1 million Japanese casualties. It would have been, more lives would have been lost, even on the Japanese side alone, in an invasion. And people say, yes, but maybe they would have surrendered. My comeback to that is they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and the Japanese still didn't surrender. The Japanese military government refused to surrender, and so Truman had to order the dropping of a second bomb 3 days later, August 9th, on Nagasaki, and the government still didn't want to surrender then. It was only that Emperor Hirohito took it into his own hands, went over the government, and in fact gave a radio address to the Japanese people. And the vast majority of the Japanese had never even heard the emperor's voice. And he said, we have to give up. But I think that left to their own devices, even after the 2 bombings, the military government would not have surrendered.
Do some alternative history here now. If Roosevelt had lived, would events have unfolded any differently?
In terms of dropping the bomb, I certainly don't think so. I mean, here's a man, and one of Truman's calculations was, if I invade and don't use the bomb, and I think this certainly would have been Roosevelt's rather as well, if I invade and the war goes on for another year and a half, and 500,000 Americans either die or are wounded, and people find out at some point, I had a bomb that could have ended it like that, how can I ever justify having made that decision, particularly in Roosevelt's case, as the man who had authorized the project in the first place? So I see no indication that Roosevelt would have paused in using the bomb.
That reminds me of Defense Secretary Leon Panetta's advice to President Obama when he was going around the room saying, should we conduct the bin Laden raid? And Panetta's advice was, sooner or later, people are going to find out that we had this chance. How are we ever going to explain to them that we had a chance and didn't take it? Same thing, chance to end the war and didn't take it.
But I think in a sense that even a starker thing, because, if you don't kill bin Laden, you don't kill bin Laden. But if you invade Japan, you may lose 500,000 Americans. So again, I say, I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I don't think he had any realistic choice.
Do you think any American president would have come to the same conclusion? Any of the men who have been presidents since Harry Truman?
Well, since Harry, no, I don't.
Okay.
Do you? You asked that as if you think you disagree with me. I have one
you're the
that
author.
I have a little question about, but I'm not going to say who.
You have a little question about one of the presidents who might not drop the bomb. Well, let's take the next president, Dwight Eisenhower. How did he feel about the bomb?
Well, that's interesting. Now that you bring that up, he was against dropping the bomb. But having said that, I still wonder. Very interesting. One of the things that impressed me most about Truman was, one, how meticulous his decision-making was. He went over it again and again, starting in April with that first briefing from Stimson and Leslie Groves. And even when he's at Potsdam, he brings all of the chiefs of staff of the U.S. military and the British military, the high command. They're all meeting together, going over it again and again. But one of the things that impressed me about Truman, one of many things, is that he sought dissent. He wasn't afraid of dissent. He didn't always listen to it, but he always welcomed it. And he does meet with, Truman meets with Eisenhower and Omar Bradley shortly before the bomb is dropped in Potsdam, after the test, and Stimson had told Eisenhower about it a couple of days before. And Eisenhower says, I don't think you should drop the bomb. I think the Japanese are going to surrender anyway. And I don't think the U.S. should be the country that introduces this fearsome technology into the world. You know, it's an intellectual exercise. Do I think that as they got closer to invading, Eisenhower might have taken a different view of that? Perhaps.
A lot of the questions sort of derive from the human stories that you've told in this book. I mean, you were real human beings that did all of this. And a lot of people have asked me, where did you do the research that turned up these individual stories?
Well, in terms of the two living people, there are websites for Hiroshima and websites for Oak Ridge. And we were able, I had a team, I had a co-writer and a researcher. We were able to find people who were still alive. And we thought that would add a tremendous amount to the story. And that's how we found Ruth Sisson and Hideko Tamura. And you know, they added so much to it because Ruth Sisson, I mentioned her just very briefly, she was the Calitron girl at Oak Ridge, but she had a tremendous interest in this. And you know, she had no idea what she was doing. It was only after the bomb had dropped that they explained to her that, in fact, you were enriching uranium. She just knew that she was doing, you know, operating knobs on this giant machine to keep the meter in the right area, and didn't realize that she was enriching uranium-235 and plutonium fuel for the bomb. But what made her story even richer was she had a boyfriend, later her fiance, later her husband, named Lawrence Huddleston. And he was an Army medic, and he had served the war in the European theater and had seen some of the worst action and had survived. And now, when the war ends on May 8th in Europe and the Germans surrender, she, like a lot of other people on the home front, are desperately worried that their loved one, having survived Europe, is now going to be shipped to an even bloodier conflict in the Pacific. And so, you know, they had a stake in this war ending. Now, she had no idea that she was creating a bomb that would take out Hiroshima and Nagasaki and as it turned out, end the war. But, you know, she was terribly worried that Lawrence was going to be sent to the Pacific, as obviously were millions of Americans.
One of the questions I have here is, what were the psychological effects on those who dropped the bomb? And let me just broaden that to, and what were the psychological effects on those whom the bomb was dropped on?
Well, the interesting thing is that Harry Truman was asked about it over and over again. And I you know, I've read his diary, I've read letters that he wrote to his sister, Margaret Truman, his daughter, you know, wrote about it. He was interviewed repeatedly. He never expressed any doubt at all about his decision. The flight crew of the Enola Gay, all 12 of them, never expressed any doubt. Some people, there was a wonderful, and he's a character in the book as well, William Lawrence, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning science reporter for the the New York Times, and he had given a log to the co-pilot, a guy named Robert Lewis, and said, you know, keep a log of everything that happens on this flight, because there wasn't room for him to fly on the initial flight. He ended up flying on the Nagasaki mission. And at one point, just as they drop the bomb and after they get out from the aftershocks, they turn the Enola Gay around and they look and they can see all the devastation. And Lewis writes in the log, my God, what have we done? Which a lot of people read as horror at the devastation. He said he was just remarking about the size, you know, the devastation, how powerful the explosive had been, but that he never had any doubts at all. And as you know, you've mentioned, Tibbets talked about it at great length and said, you know, you can't put morality into war. War is hell. People are going to die. I did what I was told to do. I dropped the bomb. It helped end the war, and would do it again. The people who expressed the greatest doubt about it, really the only people that were closely involved, were the scientists. Albert Einstein, who in fact had written to Roosevelt in 1939 and had raised the issue of atomic power and the concern that the Nazis were going to get it first, and you didn't want Hitler to have sole use of an atomic bomb. He said shortly before his death in the mid-50s, the one mistake in my life that I truly regret was alerting Roosevelt to the bomb. But the most interesting was Robert Oppenheimer, who was the brains behind the project, the scientific director. And just a few months after the bombing in the fall of '45, he goes to the White House and meets with Truman, and he says, "Mr. President, I have terrible second thoughts. I feel I have blood on my hands." And Truman has nothing, won't have anything to do with it. And he says, "I have blood on my hands. Let me worry about it." And Oppenheimer is escorted out gently. And Truman turns to his staff and he says, "I never want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again."
And what about the psychological effect on the survivors of the bomb?
Well, it's interesting. And I get that mostly from one of the interesting things that I didn't realize is the U.S. got involved in a very sophisticated public relations campaign after the bombing, basically to cover it up. So you had, on the one hand, the people in the state side of the Pentagon who were putting out all of these stories about, the extraordinary efforts and the ingenuity and, the scientific breakthroughs of the Manhattan Project, all the positives. Meanwhile, now Douglas MacArthur, has become the supreme commander of the occupation forces in Japan, and there was a strict censorship to keep the American people from knowing what was going on. And a Japanese film crew came, I forget the exact date, but the first crew to come to Hiroshima and took extensive footage of the damage, and the American occupying soldiers confiscated the footage. In the end, the great breakthrough in finding out what really happened was there was a magazine editor in New York of the New Yorker, a legendary editor named William Shawn, and he thought there was a great story about what had happened. So he commissioned a war correspondent named John Hersey to get to Hiroshima, and he, instead of coming in from the east, from the United States, where the occupiers would have been able to control him, came in through China and across China to Japan, evaded all of the U.S. forces, spent a considerable period of time on the ground in Hiroshima, got to talk to the survivors, and then came back to the States, didn't write anything there where it would have had to go through, came back to New York, and then wrote what I think one could say was the most powerful magazine article in history. Shawn decided he was going to devote the entire, this came out more than a year later in '46, the entire issue of the New Yorker to it. It was 30,000 words. They took out all the cartoons, all of that stuff. And then by the end of '46, it was published as a book, and 3 million copies were sold. And it was really the first that Americans knew of what had happened. And what Hersey basically did is he identified the Hibakusha. And the Hibakusha were the people who had survived the bombing. And you would think, well, maybe they were heroes in Hiroshima. Quite the contrary. They were considered damaged goods by the people in Hiroshima because they had suffered the effects. Those who had survived had suffered terrible health effects, radiation poisoning, other things. There was no interest in hiring them for jobs because they didn't have any energy. The women were considered damaged goods, and so nobody wanted to marry them because there was a thought that they lacked energy and they would have illness, and if they had children, they would have birth defects. So they were they were there, but they were shunned. And at one point, this woman I told you about, Hideko Tamura, she was 17 years old, and her life was so bleak that she decided, she went to a train station and she decided she was going to throw herself in front of a train and commit suicide. but just before the train got to the station, it stopped. And the reason it stopped was because somebody else, a little bit further down the track, had thrown himself in front of the train and committed suicide.
Well, on that happy note, we come to 7 o'clock, and it means you don't have to answer the question I was going to ask you, which is you haven't just written a book. It looks like you've started a franchise of countdown books. What's going to be your next countdown?
Well, let me say, first of all, I was told by my publishers that you've got to always hold up your book. So here it is, Countdown 1945. It's #3 on Amazon. I'd love to be #1, and Father's Day is coming around, so it'd be a really good gift. I have thought of a few countdowns, but I'm waiting to have another meeting with Nancy Pelosi so she can tell me a story. I don't know, but I think it is the beginning of a franchise because, as I think I said to you in the interview, if you do Countdown 1945, you can do Countdown anything. You just got to find a story that merits this kind of telling.
Well, you did it justice. Thank you very much.
David,
And
thank you very much.
To all the people who tuned in. I think we have over 700 people online. Not bad. So thank you all.